In the chaos of post-Soviet Russia, power was a fragile thing. Streets flooded with crime, markets collapsed, the government stumbled. And in the shadows of this chaos, a former KGB officer quietly watched, calculated, and waited. Vladimir Putin was not a headline. He was a process, not a revolutionary, not a celebrity. But when a single mistake was made by those in charge, a misstep by a weakened leadership desperate to cling to power, Putin was ready. That moment, seemingly small at the time, would change the course of Russia forever. In this documentary, we will trace Putin's rise from obscurity to the Kremlin, revealing the networks, strategies, and pivotal errors that made him the most powerful man in Russia. To understand Putin, you have to understand the world he entered. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Russia was a country in freefall, its economy shattered, its political institutions weak, and its people disillusioned. Crime syndicates ran the streets. Oligarchs seized industries overnight, and amid the chaos, ordinary Russians felt powerless, fearful, and desperate for stability. Putin, a former KGB officer, had spent years mastering bureaucracy, surveillance, and influence. His training taught him patience, discretion, and above all, strategy. He knew how to read people, understand power, and identify opportunities when others were blind to them. While the country floundered, Putin quietly climbed the ranks, first in St. Petersburg politics, then into the federal government, always observing, always calculating. It was in this vacuum of chaos and fear that the seeds of his future power were planted. And soon, a single mistake by those at the top would give him the opening he had been waiting for. The pivotal moment came not from Putin's ambition, but from the mistakes of those who were supposed to control him. In the late 1990s, Russia was led by Boris Yeltsin, a man admired abroad but weakened at home. His administration was riddled with corruption, his health failing, and his political judgment increasingly questioned. It was a leadership desperate for loyalty, a government clinging to power amidst chaos, and yet blind to the threats within its own ranks. A miscalculation, a dismissal of capable rivals, a misplaced trust, a failure to anticipate a quiet, disciplined observer created a vacuum at the very top, and Putin was ready. As head of the Federal Security Service, FSB, he had the perfect platform, access to intelligence, political networks, and the levers of influence that few others could reach. He didn't rush, he didn't broadcast his intentions. Instead, he orchestrated a subtle takeover, consolidating allies, neutralizing opponents, and presenting himself as the man who could restore stability. On December 31, 1999, Yeltsin resigned. The country awoke to a startling reality. A former KGB officer, largely unknown to the public, was now Russia's acting president. One mistake, one blind spot, one calculated man waiting in the wings. That was the moment that changed Russian history forever. From that point on, every political maneuver, every economic reform, and every foreign policy decision would be shaped by a man who had learned early that power is not given, it is seized. Once in the Kremlin, Putin moved with precision. He understood that true power in Russia was not held in the office of the president alone, but in the networks around it, the oligarchs who controlled wealth, the bureaucrats who managed the state, and the media that shaped public perception. With a calculated strategy, he began consolidating influence. Powerful business figures were either co-opted or removed, ensuring loyalty to his administration. Media outlets, previously chaotic and independent, were gradually brought under central control, creating a narrative of stability and strength. Political rivals were sidelined through subtle intimidation, legal pressures, or carefully timed purges, making clear that dissent would not be tolerated. Putin's image, carefully curated, was that of a man who could restore order to a fractured nation, a leader who promised discipline, national pride, and a return to Russia's prominence on the world stage. Every decision reinforced this perception. Every media appearance strengthened his reputation as decisive and unyielding. Behind the carefully crafted persona, however, was a man whose power rested on a deep understanding of networks, a former intelligence officer who knew how to manipulate influence, consolidate loyalty, and navigate the treacherous corridors of Russian politics. By the time he stood for election in 2000, Putin was no longer just the acting president. He was the architect of a new Russia, a leader whose rise was as much about strategic patience and calculated alliances as it was about opportunity. Putin's power was never meant to be fragile. It was carefully built on a foundation of loyalty, control, and influence. The Federal Security Service, FSB, and other security agencies became both his shield and his sword, neutralizing potential threats before they could grow. Trusted allies from his KGB days were placed in key positions across the government, ensuring that decisions were aligned with his strategy. On the economic front, oligarchs, wealthy businessmen who had once exploited Russia's chaotic privatization, were brought into his orbit. Some were rewarded for cooperation, others were removed or pressured into compliance. This created a system where money and influence were tightly linked to loyalty. Meanwhile, political parties and regional leaders were subtly subordinated to the Kremlin, creating the image of unity and inevitability around Putin's rule. By controlling these networks, intelligence, finance, media, and politics, Putin transformed Russia into a centralized power structure. The result? A leader who was not only the face of the state, but the master of the machinery that kept it running. Through these alliances and structures, Putin became almost untouchable. His rise was no accident. It was the product of strategy, patience, and a deep understanding of the levers of power. Putin's consolidation of power was not confined within Russia's borders. From the moment he took control, he understood that global influence was inseparable from domestic authority. Early foreign policy moves were strategic, reasserting Russia's presence in former Soviet states, projecting strength in Europe, and testing the limits of Western alliances. NATO expansion, conflicts in Chechnya and Georgia, and subtle interventions in political systems abroad were all part of a calculated plan to reshape Russia's position in the world. Putin also recognized the power of image on the global stage. By cultivating a persona of decisiveness, toughness, and national pride, he not only strengthened his standing at home, but commanded attention and caution abroad. Meanwhile, economic networks tied to oligarchs and state-controlled industries provided the resources to fund strategic international projects. Energy, banking, and trade became tools of influence used to reward allies and pressure opponents. The West quickly realized that Russia was no longer a passive observer. Putin's rise was more than a domestic phenomenon. It was the beginning of a Russia that could negotiate, compete, and sometimes confront the world from a position of coordinated strength. Every move on the international chessboard reflected the careful orchestration of a leader who had mastered both the machinery of his own country and the psychology of global power. By the mid-2000s, Putin had transformed Russia into a state where power was centralized, loyalty was rewarded, and dissent was carefully managed. The machinery he built was multi-layered. Security services ensured that no rival could gain traction. Oligarchs understood that wealth came with obedience, aligning their fortunes with his vision. Media outlets broadcast a narrative of stability, strength, and inevitability, shaping public perception to accept his authority. These systems were not accidental, they were deliberate, designed to make Putin not just a president, but a symbol of continuity and control. Even as the world changed around him, he remained adaptable, consolidating influence over regional governors, political parties, and state institutions. Internally, this created a perception that opposition was futile. Externally, it projected the image of a Russia that could assert itself on the global stage without hesitation. By combining strategic patience, intelligence expertise, and meticulous control of networks, Putin became a figure who could withstand challenges from inside the Kremlin and from the wider world. His rise was no longer a story of opportunity, it was the story of mastery over every lever of power. One mistake, one moment, and a former KGB officer reshaped Russia forever. Vladimir Putin seized the opening, and the world would never be the same again.